The medieval doctor is a strange figure in our minds. We picture him in a dark robe, maybe with a pointed beak mask, holding a leech or a saw. Part of that image is right, but most of it is wrong. The world of medieval medicine was more complex and varied than we think. There wasn't just one kind of doctor, there was a whole hierarchy of healers, each with a different job and a different level of respect. At the very top was the physician. This was the person we would call a doctor today. He was almost always a man. He was educated often at one of the new universities sprouting up across Europe, like Salerno in Italy or Paris in France. He would have studied for years. But what did he study? He read the classics. The foundational texts came from ancient Greece and Rome. Hippocrates and Galen were the undisputed masters. Their works were treated almost like scripture. He also read translations of great Arab scholars like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was a core textbook for centuries. So, this university-trained physician could read Latin. He was a scholar. His job was not to get his hands dirty. He was a thinker, a diagnostician. He would visit wealthy patients, observe their symptoms, and consult his books and charts. He was concerned with the internal workings of the body, with the balance of things. Surgery, bleeding, and the messy work of direct treatment were often beneath him. He would prescribe a course of action, and someone else would carry it out. He was expensive. Only the rich could afford him. Below the physician was the surgeon. Today, surgeons are at the top of the medical field. In the Middle Ages, they were seen as skilled craftsmen, not intellectuals. They learned their trade through apprenticeship, not university. They were the ones who got their hands dirty. They set broken bones. They removed bladder stones in a brutal, painful procedure. They pulled teeth. They treated wounds on the battlefield, digging out arrowheads and stitching up gashes. They performed amputations, a last resort to stop the spread of infection. They knew anatomy from direct practical experience, but they lacked the theoretical framework of the physician. There was a clear line between the two. The physician thought the surgeon did, and then there was the barber-surgeon. This was a common figure in towns and cities. Your local barber could do more than just cut hair. The striped barber's pole we still see today originally symbolized blood and bandages. The barbers had sharp razors and a steady hand, so they were the logical choice for small procedures. They were the ones who performed most of the bloodletting, a very common treatment. They would also pull teeth, lance boils, and perform other minor surgeries. They were the everyday, affordable option for the common person. Don't forget the apothecary. This was the medieval pharmacist. He worked in a shop filled with jars of dried herbs, minerals, and animal parts. The physician would write a prescription, and the patient would take it to the apothecary to be filled. Apothecaries had a deep knowledge of plants and their properties, what we call materia medica. They ground powders, mixed ointments, and brewed potions. They were also a source of medical advice themselves, especially for those who couldn't afford a physician. Finally, outside of this formal system, there were countless other healers. Most people, especially in rural villages, would never see a university physician. They relied on local healers. Often these were women, known as wise women or cunning folk. Their knowledge was passed down through generations. It was a mix of herbal remedies, traditional folklore, and practical experience. They acted as midwives, delivering babies. They treated common illnesses with remedies from the garden. The church was often suspicious of them, sometimes accusing them of witchcraft, but for most ordinary people, they were the only source of medical care available. So, when we talk about a medieval doctor, we need to be specific. Are we talking about the wealthy Latin-speaking scholar who diagnosed based on the stars and the color of urine? Or the battlefield surgeon sawing off a knight's leg? Or the barber in the town square with a basin of leeches? Or the old woman on the edge of the village with a pouch full of healing herbs? They all existed. They all practiced a form of medicine, and they all operated within a shared, and to us, very strange, understanding of how the human body worked. To understand what medieval doctors did, you have to understand what they believed. Their entire medical system was built on a single, powerful idea, the theory of the four humors. This wasn't a medieval invention. It came from the ancient Greeks, especially Hippocrates and later Galen. For over 1,000 years, it was the unquestioned truth about human health. The idea was simple. The human body was made of four basic fluids, or humors. These were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor had its own qualities. Blood was hot and wet. Phlegm was cold and wet. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. These four humors corresponded to the four elements that were believed to make up the entire universe. Blood was linked to air, phlegm to water, yellow bile to fire, and black bile to earth. They were also connected to the four seasons. Blood was dominant in the spring, yellow bile in the summer, black bile in the autumn, and phlegm in the winter. A person was healthy when these four humors were in perfect balance. Your unique personality or temperament was determined by which humor was naturally dominant in your body. If you had a lot of blood, you were sanguine, cheerful, optimistic, and rosy-cheeked. If you had too much phlegm, you were phlegmatic, calm, slow, and unemotional. A person with excess yellow bile was choleric, angry, irritable, and aggressive. And someone with too much black bile was melancholic, sad, depressed, and pensive. We still use these words today long after the theory behind them has gone. Illness was, quite simply, an imbalance. Every sickness, from a common cold to a deadly plague, was seen as a problem of the humors. Maybe you had too much of one humor, or maybe one of your humors had become corrupted, too hot or too cold. The doctor's job was not to kill a germ or fight a specific disease. His job was to identify the imbalance and help the body restore its natural equilibrium. This theory explained everything. A fever was a sign of excess heat, likely caused by too much blood or yellow bile. A cough that produced phlegm was clearly a case of too much cold, wet humor. Arthritis, with its stiff joints, was a cold and dry ailment, probably related to an excess of black bile. Everything fit neatly into the system. This worldview shaped every single thing a doctor did. Its diagnosis was about figuring out which humor was out of balance. Treatment was about removing the excess humor or counteracting its qualities. For example, if a patient had a fever, which was a hot and wet condition, the doctor's goal was to cool and dry them out. He might prescribe a diet of cold foods like cucumbers or fish. He might recommend herbs with drying properties. And most famously, he might decide to remove the excess hot, wet humor, which was blood. This is the logic behind bloodletting. The environment also played a huge role. The air you breathed, the food you ate, the water you drank, even the alignment of the stars could all affect your humoral balance. A doctor would give advice on all these things. He might tell a patient to move to a place with drier air or to avoid certain foods. This was called regulating the non-naturals: air, food and drink, sleep, exercise, excretion, and the emotions. It was a holistic approach. The body was not a machine with broken parts. It was a little universe, a microcosm, reflecting the greater universe, the macrocosm. It's easy for us to look back and call the system primitive or wrong. And in a scientific sense, it was wrong. There are no four humors. But it wasn't stupid. It was a complete and logical system. It had an explanation for everything. It gave doctors a clear framework for thinking about sickness and health. It provided a roadmap for treatment. For over a millennium, from the ancient world through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, this was not just a theory. It was the fundamental truth of medicine. Every diagnosis, every prescription, and every treatment was based on this elegant, powerful, and ultimately incorrect idea. So a patient is sick, a medieval physician is called to the bedside. What happens next? The doctor didn't have a stethoscope, a thermometer, or a blood pressure cuff. He couldn't order an x-ray or a lab test. His diagnostic tools were his own senses and a deep understanding of the humoral system. The process was part observation, part interrogation, and part divination. The most important diagnostic tool was the urine flask. The examination of urine, called uroscopy, was the hallmark of the medieval physician. He would arrive carrying a clear glass flask, often in a special woven basket. The patient's urine would be collected and held up to the light. The doctor would examine it with intense concentration. He wasn't looking for bacteria or sugar. He was looking at its color, its consistency, its smell, and even its taste. There were detailed charts called urine wheels that linked different colors of urine to specific ailments. A pale, watery urine might suggest too much phlegm. A bright yellow or orange urine could indicate an excess of yellow bile. Reddish urine pointed to too much blood. A dark or black urine was a very bad sign, suggesting an excess of black bile and a high risk of death. The doctor would also look for sediments or cloudiness, which could give clues about which organ was affected. The taste was a last resort, but some texts did suggest it. A sweet taste, for example, could indicate a problem we now know as diabetes. The uroscopy was so central to medicine that the urine flask became the symbol of the physician, much like the stethoscope is today. Next, the doctor would feel the patient's pulse. This was another ancient technique refined by Galen. Medieval physicians had a complex system for classifying pulses. They didn't just count the beats per minute. They felt for its strength, its regularity, its speed, and its rhythm. They used evocative descriptions, comparing a weak pulse to an ant's crawl. Different types of pulses were thought to correspond to different humoral imbalances. It was a subtle art, requiring great sensitivity and experience. The doctor would also talk to the patient, of course. He would ask about their diet, their daily habits, their emotional state, and the nature of their excretions. He would observe the patient's complexion, listen to their breathing, and examine their tongue. All of these were clues to the underlying humoral state of the body, but diagnosis wasn't just about the body. The medieval physician believed that the heavens directly influenced human health. Astrology was not a fringe belief, it was a core part of medical science. The doctor would consult an astronomical almanac. He needed to know the patient's date of birth and the exact time the illness began. Using this information, he would cast a horoscope. The position of the planets and the stars was believed to govern different parts of the body. The moon, for instance, had a powerful influence on the body's fluids. A doctor would never perform a bloodletting or a surgery at an astrologically unfavorable time. The alignment of the planets could tell him whether an illness was likely to be long or short, mild or fatal. It was a tool for prognosis, the art of predicting the course of a disease. In many ways, prognosis was more important than diagnosis. A good doctor was one who could accurately predict what would happen. It managed the patient's and the family's expectations. If the doctor could say, the fever will break on the third day, and it did, his reputation grew, even if his treatment had little to do with the recovery. If he foresaw a fatal outcome, it prepared the family and allowed time for last rites, which was a matter of eternal importance. The entire process was a performance of wisdom. The physician, with his scholarly robes, his Latin phrases, his urine flask, and his astrological charts, projected an aura of profound knowledge. He was reading the secrets of the body and the cosmos. While his methods were not based on science as we know it, they were based on a coherent and deeply held system of belief. He wasn't guessing, he was applying a complex set of rules to the evidence he gathered through his senses, creating a complete picture of the patient's illness in body and spirit. Once a diagnosis was made, treatment began. The goal was always the same: restore the balance of the humors. The medieval doctor's toolkit was filled with methods designed to remove excess humors, counteract their qualities, and support the body's natural healing abilities. Some of these treatments seem brutal to us now, while others are surprisingly gentle and holistic. The most famous and common treatment was bloodletting, or phlebotomy, since many illnesses, especially fevers and inflammations, were thought to be caused by an excess of blood, a hot, wet humor. The logical solution was to remove some of it. There were two main ways to do this. The first was venesection, which involved cutting open a vein with a small knife called a lancet, where medical charts showed specific points on the body that were best for bleeding for certain ailments. The doctor or barber surgeon would make a small cut, usually in the arm, and let a prescribed amount of blood drain into a bowl. The second method was using leeches. Leeches were applied to the skin, where they would attach themselves and suck blood. They were seen as a gentler way to draw out blood from a specific area. After the leech was full, it would fall off. Leeches were so common that the word leech itself became a synonym for a healer. Bloodletting was used for almost everything, from headaches to pneumonia to bouts of melancholy. It was a standard procedure performed not just to cure illness, but also as a preventative measure to maintain good health. If the problem wasn't excess blood, but another humor, the doctor had other ways to purge the body. To get rid of excess phlegm or bile, he would prescribe emetics to induce vomiting or laxatives to purge the bowels. These were often powerful herbal concoctions made from plants like hellebore or senna. The idea was to physically expel the offending humor from the body. Another, more extreme method was cauterization. This involved burning a wound or a sore with a red-hot iron. It was excruciatingly painful, but it was used to stop bleeding, seal amputations, and treat things like tumors or persistent sores. The heat was thought to have a drying effect, which could counteract a wet ailment. Not all treatments were so violent. Diet was a huge part of medieval medicine. Since every food, herb, and spice had its own humoral properties, hot, cold, wet, or dry, a doctor could prescribe a specific diet to counteract an imbalance. For a fever, a hot condition, he would prescribe cold foods like lettuce, cucumber, or pears. For a cold illness, like a lingering cough, he might recommend hot foods like onions, garlic, pepper, and wine. This was the principle of treating opposites. It was a way of rebalancing the body from the inside out. Herbal medicine was central to this. The apothecary's shop was a treasure trove of remedies. Plants were a doctor's main source of drugs. He would prescribe syrups, powders, and poultices made from a vast array of botanicals. The willow bark, which contains a substance similar to aspirin, was used for pain and fever. Foxglove was used for heart problems, a practice that continues today with the drug digitalis. Mint was used for indigestion, and poppy juice, or opium, was a powerful painkiller. The knowledge of herbs was extensive, a mix of classical learning and local folklore. When it came to surgery, the approach was direct and pragmatic. Surgeons set bones with splints and casts. They stitched wounds with needles made of bone or bronze, using thread made from silk or animal gut. On the battlefield, they were skilled at removing arrows and crossbow bolts. One of the most dramatic operations was trepanation, which involved drilling a hole in the skull. This was done to relieve pressure on the brain from a head injury, but also sometimes to release evil spirits thought to be causing seizures or madness. All of this was done without a real understanding of germs. The concept of antiseptic surgery was centuries away. Surgeons might wash their hands, but their tools were not sterilized. Infection was the single biggest killer. Similarly, there was no effective anesthesia. Patients were given alcohol, opium, or other sedatives to dull the pain, but they were essentially conscious during operations. Surgery was a terrifying, agonizing last resort. The best surgeons were the fastest ones. Speed was everything when your patient was awake and screaming. The medieval healer's world was a blend of theory and brutal practicality, of gentle dietary advice and searing hot iron. The world of medieval medicine extended beyond individual doctors and their patients. It also included institutions, societal crises, and the slow march of progress. Looking at these gives us a bigger picture of what health and healing were like for the whole of society. Hospitals existed in the Middle Ages, but they were very different from the hospitals we know today. They weren't primarily places for treatment and cure. They were charitable institutions, usually run by the church by monks and nuns. The word hospital is related to hospitality. These places were created to offer care and shelter to the needy, the poor, the elderly, orphans, and pilgrims on a long journey. If a sick person went to a medieval hospital, they would be given a bed, food, and basic nursing care. The monks or nuns would tend to their comfort, wash them, and pray for their souls. This spiritual care was seen as just as important, if not more important, than physical care. While some larger hospitals might have a physician on staff to offer advice, they were not centers of medical innovation or aggressive treatment. They were places of refuge and compassion, focused on easing suffering rather than fighting disease. For most people, a hospital was a place you went to die with some dignity, not a place you went to get well. Nothing challenged the medical system of the Middle Ages more than the Black Death. When the plague swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, it was a catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. It killed a third or even half of the population. The doctors were helpless. Their theories of humoral imbalance couldn't explain the rapid, horrifying spread of the disease. They didn't understand contagion. Physicians tried their best, applying their usual methods. They prescribed bloodletting and purges. They recommended diets and herbal remedies. They advised people to burn aromatic woods like juniper and rosemary to purify the bad air, or miasma, which they believed was the cause of the plague. This is where the famous plague doctor costume comes from. The long beak was stuffed with herbs and spices, acting as a kind of primitive respirator to protect the doctor from the poisonous miasma. The long, waxed coat was meant to protect their skin from contact, but none of it worked. The plague shattered confidence in the medical establishment. It showed the profound limits of their knowledge. Doctors died just as readily as their patients. The crisis did, however, lead to some important developments. In response to the plague, some Italian cities developed the first public health measures. They established quarantine boards, isolating ships and travelers for 40 days, a quarantino, before allowing them into the city. They created plague hospitals, or lazarettos, outside the city walls to care for the sick in isolation. This was the beginning of thinking about disease as a public problem, not just an individual one. So, what is the legacy of the medieval doctor? It's tempting to dismiss the entire period as a dark age of medicine, full of superstition and harmful practices. And it's true that many treatments, like bloodletting, probably did more harm than good. Their core theory was wrong, but that's not the whole story. The Middle Ages laid important groundwork. The founding of universities created a formal system for medical education and the professionalization of physicians. The deep respect for ancient texts, while it sometimes held them back, also preserved a body of medical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The work of surgeons, based on direct experience, slowly advanced the understanding of human anatomy. This was especially true toward the end of the period, when some universities began to permit human dissection, a critical step toward modern medicine. The medieval doctor did the best he could with the knowledge he had. He operated within a complete and logical, if flawed, system. He offered explanations for suffering, he provided comfort and care. He used his knowledge of herbs to create real medicines, some of which are still in use. He tried to heal. He was not a quacker or fool. He was a product of his time, standing on the bridge between an ancient world of humors and spirits and the new world of science that was just beginning to dawn.